All right, good afternoon, LinkedIn. I am Kate Strachny and I'm here with Dr. JT Kostman. Today we're going to talk about data, ethics, and privacy. So I'd like to welcome JT. He works at Grant Thornton where he's the chief data scientist, and he's also a mathematician and psychologist. So welcome to our live stream.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here. I've been looking forward to this.
All right. For those of you that don't know JT, would you like to just say a few words about what you do and who you are?
Oh, well, I don't know if I want to say anything about what I do, but yeah, I am by training. I'm a data scientist, a mathematician, and a psychologist. And I guess what I do is a combination of I'm an executive, an educator, an investor. I have sat on boards for, just recently sat on the board for a holding company where we're making substantial investments in a lot of technology companies. Prior to that, I was the chief data officer for Time Inc., where I was a member of the XCOM there. Before that, I was chief data scientist for Samsung. And before that, I spent about a decade primarily with the U.S. intelligence community, working with the U.S. defense intelligence and community and security agencies, and helping to keep America safe.
All right, awesome. For those of you tuning in, you have the right, and we actually welcome you to ask any questions you want. Dr. Kostman is ready for anything and everything.
That's right, and you can ask anything, and I'll answer anything that doesn't get me sent to federal prison or having to live with Ed Snowden in Russia, because I did my postdoc there at Moscow State University, and I don't know if I want to move back.
Russia's not that bad.
I love Russia.
Russia, so yeah. I take offense,
Moscow,
but it's okay.
No, I love Moscow.
From Tajikistan.
But I don't want to have to go.
No, okay, I understand. There's a difference between wanting to
That's
and having
exactly
to.
Right.
All right, so for those of you that tuned in, would love to hear where you're coming in from. And like I said, questions on data science, ethics, and privacy are welcome. I do have a few questions that I've prepared, so we're going to go ahead and get started.
Okay.
All right, so let's lay the groundwork. What does it even mean to be ethical in the data science space?
You know, that's actually become one of my hot button issues, because I don't know that there's a distinction between being ethical in the data science space and just being ethical. And it's something that we have sort of forgotten about, particularly in the business and the professional world. Starting in in 1970, actually, I was going to say starting in the 70s, but in 1970, an economist, Milton Friedman, famously wrote this article for the New Yorker, for the New York Times. And he essentially asserted that it's not up to businesses to be ethical, to be socially responsible. It's up to shareholders. And a business's primary responsibility, he claimed, was to his shareholders. And that started a movement. You know, then we had, the rise of Ayn Rand and her books. And then we started talking about the movie Wall Street and Gordon Gekko and Greed is Good. And this notion of shareholder primacy. And businesses became all about, never mind ethics, never mind morality, worry about the bottom line, worry about making a buck. And that has become something that's come to haunt us. And so I spend a good part of my time now talking to corporate directors. I do a monthly column for the National Association of Corporate Directors Directorship Magazine titled Board Tech. And I'm talking about technology issues, but I'm also talking about changing the expectations of us as board members from one of shareholder primacy to stakeholder primacy. And I think those two letters are changing everything. I think the same thing is true for data scientists. I think we have to start thinking about not just how do we help our businesses be more profitable, which should be an absolutely essential concern, but it's not the only concern we should have.
So do you see companies moving in the direction kind of away from shareholder and towards protecting the stakeholder?
I do. You know, Satya Nadella from Microsoft is leading some of this charge, and you see Tim Cook talking about this, and you see, interestingly, a lot of it coming out of Silicon Valley, and I forgot his name for a moment, but the new CEO for Uber is talking about a lot of this as well, and more CEOs are starting to get that they're part of a larger ecosystem, that it's not just a responsibility to the shareholders, but how can we forget about the customers, the community, right? Even the employees. In some countries, like in Germany now, stakeholders are represented as a part of the board. In Japan as well, I believe in France. increasingly we're seeing this movement. It's inevitable. We're going to see more and more of that in the U.S. We've already seen the first inkling of it, I think, with the new law in California that requires you to have a woman serving on every board. Now, that isn't speaking broadly to all of society, but it's a recognition that there was an aspect of our society that was being underrepresented and a voice that needs to be heard. And I think we'll see more of that.
Yeah, that's actually my next question. So you're saying that now there's a trend moving to the stakeholder. Do you have like a good example you can share with the audience of where a company behaved unethically? I'm sure you have tons.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, well, and with respect to this space, to data, the obvious example is Cambridge Analytica, right? And I, fortunately or unfortunately, I had some firsthand experience with all this as it came up. I think you know, I led the social media strategy for the 2012 Obama campaign.
Yep.
And so we did a lot of that data collection, and we won, by the way. You hadn't been watching then.
Wait, you did?
Yeah, we did.
I've been under a rock.
Well,
That's
he
awesome.
won. I took it as a win. But, and so it was great, and we invented some new capabilities and some new ways of looking at data. And so Cambridge Analytica approached me, and this was back when I was Chief Data Officer for Time Inc. And I was speaking at a conference, and one of their guys stalked me and came to the conference, and he was there to see me, and I was polite about it, and no, I wasn't interested. Waited for me on the street, literally.
Wow.
And then just kept chasing after me, and finally my assistant gave him a meeting time, and I don't know why, but gave him 2 hours. 20 minutes into the meeting, I've never done this before, but 20 minutes into the meeting, I showed them out of the office and told them, I wanted nothing to do with them. I just thought they were so unethical in their practices. But that became just one example of a larger problem. And what was it that they did that was really so unethical is, we've seen an increasing amount of duplicity in the utilization, the representation of how people use data and what they're doing with it. You know, I happen to be a friend of a friend was Alan Dershowitz, the attorney.
Alan Dershowitz, yeah.
Yeah, and so we're having dinner one night. We're at this place in Florida. It's a very relaxed setting. And so I was joking with him and talking with him, and I said, Alan, just wondering, you know those EULAs, the end user license agreement, the T&Cs for all these websites and apps. Have you ever actually read one of those?
You mean the one where you opt in to give all your
exactly.
information?
Just right, and they come through and
Candy Crush or something?
right, exactly. What do you do, right? And so I asked him, and I said, have you ever read one? He said, oh God, no. Really? And I mean, this is Alan Dershowitz. He's never even read one. And I'm reminded there was this company in the UK back April 1st. We just had the anniversary, April 1st, 2010.
Yeah.
They put out a new EULA, end user license agreement. And it said in the little small, the small print somewhere, it said, if you use our service, you agree to confer to us immortal use of your soul. And you give us your soul.
Oh my God.
For using our service. 7,500 people just click, yup. And
well, nobody reads that.
That's the point.
So that's actually one thing I want to talk to you about is how do we get away from people just opting in? Like, is it the company's responsibility, or is it the public's responsibility, or is it the government? Like, who? I mean,
yes. Is the answer. It's all our responsibility. What we're going to see, though, inevitably, we're going to see some legislation. We're going to see
like GDPR
like GDPR. But you know what I think the big turning point is going to be? There has to be government involvement, but governments only enact laws typically, effectively, retroactively.
Right.
It's very hard to put laws in place sort of, anticipatorily. You have to wait until harm was done. And so we're going to see, as a consequence of these things, we'll see harm. But what's really going to change things is the civil aspect of law. Will be torts. Here's what's going to happen, mark my words. We're going to find some smart out-of-the-box thinking young attorney who's going to say, let me see if I got this right. According to the generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP, data has no value. Well, we know that's nonsense, right? We know that when there's a data breach, there's a harm done, right? There's an actual loss that's incurred to the company. And so it's a fairly simple matter to assert that data has value. Well, if it has value, whose value is it? Does
Yeah.
it belong to the company or to the consumer? And I think what you're going to see is some attorney is going to make a class action claim and be able to say that these consumers were harmed,
Yeah.
and it becomes their data. And if there's a harm, then there has to be a remedy, and we're going to have to come up with better strictures.
But is it their data if they didn't collect it?
I don't know. I don't know. I think but that's a question that I think has to be answered, and it has to be answered, frankly, by the courts. I can have an opinion on it,
Right.
and my opinion is, I think there's a combination, right? There's of value. On the one hand, what I do in the public sphere, you should be able to, if you're a journalist, and you should be able to say, oh, I saw this guy walking along the street in a black shirt. I think that's fine. But can you come to my home and rummage through my rubbish and look into my file? I don't know. I think we get to that place where we say, where is that border of privacy?
Yeah.
And it's something that we're really wrangling with now, and it's going to be one of the most important issues of the next, I think, very near future. Over the next 5 years, this is going to start to really play out.
Yeah, I agree. So we have a couple of comments and questions that came in.
Uh-oh.
So Jennifer Cooper says, immortal use of your soul. Whoa, that is heavy. So,
Yeah, right?
Yes,
And
true.
would you have signed it though, Jennifer? I mean, tell the truth, right? Have you ever really read one of those EULAs all the way through every line? And look it up. It was GameStop, April 1st, 2010, out of the UK. All you gotta do is Google for EULA, and soul, and you'll find it.
Oh man, okay, so there was a question about, do you think the law of data privacy is still there?
There is no law of data privacy, really. I mean, we have GDPR, we have the California privacy laws that are nearly as strict as, but they're discordant and they're chaotic. There are a couple of states now that have laws that prohibit the collection of biometric data, which I think is very interesting. There's one that is going to be tested in the courts. And so what does that mean? Think of things like facial recognition,
Yeah.
right? So if I'm walking into a grocery store now,
Yeah.
wouldn't it be nice if it could do facial recognition on me, and then it can RFID tag all the things in my cart, and I can just get stuff and I can walk out of it? And Amazon is already testing
Yeah,
some of this.
right.
But there are several states, I think it's Michigan and Minnesota. Interesting, I'm not 100% certain, but there are 2 states, and I think those are the ones, that say you can't collect biometric information unless you specifically opt in. So
Right.
what if you and I go into the store together, I opted in, you have it.
I
Now
stay
what?
outside, I don't know.
Do you? I don't know. Right? Do they have to have a sign that, Kate's not welcome?
Oh, they have those signs everywhere.
Everyone, yeah, I know. It's usually just understood.
Thanks a lot. All right, let's move on from that topic and talk about algorithm bias. I have a lot of opinions on the matter myself, but I'd like to hear from you. So let's start with, can a machine learning algorithm truly be unbiased?
So let me be controversial and say, I hope not. I hope they're biased. That's what algorithms are supposed to do. They're supposed to bias, they're supposed to discriminate. Let me give you an example. When I was at Time Inc., we had several magazines in our portfolio. One of them is Essence Magazine,
Okay.
which is the magazine for African American women.
Okay.
They have this great annual festival, and the magazine really caters to this clientele. Believe it or not, they think it's more important. They see themselves as having a social mission, even more than profit, right? They have to meet the needs of this audience. But I was a member of the XCOM, so I like profit. So one of the things they started talking about was, how do we put out additional products?
Okay.
And so they talked about this product they called the Essence Beauty Box.
Okay.
And they would send this product to...
Like cosmetics or?
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly, but tailored specifically to dark-complected women, right?
Okay.
And so they would send this thing every month if you opted into the program, and you would receive this gift. Well, they advertised it and nobody wanted it. Nobody would buy it. Why? Well, it turns out, and you hate to generalize, but it turns out within the culture of black women generally, and in particular African American women, the idea of self-indulgence was anathema. largely, right?
Okay.
It was very hard for our clients, our customers, our readers to say they would spend the money, and the phrase we heard was waste money on themselves. If they had discretionary money, they would give it to the children, to the church, to their spouses, to their family, to community, no problem.
Okay.
But spending that money on themselves, not so much. So what do we do? Well, I said to myself, okay, how do we just not give up on this product? Well, let me work from the assumption that I'm a boy, and boys are...
Wait, you're a boy?
I am a boy. And boys have some things in common. One of them is we're stupid. And one of the ways in which we're stupid is when it comes the days before a major event, all boys do the same thing. Uh-oh, what do I get her, right?
Yeah.
Whether that's your mom or it's your girlfriend, it's your wife, it's your daughter, we wait until 2-3 days.
The day of.
Right,
yes.
exactly. And so I thought, why don't we, if I'm dumb and a lot of my friends are dumb and a lot of my friends are black and they're also boys, and so we're all dumb, and so how do we speak to them? And so I started looking for...
To target them.
Right,
Okay.
and say, how could you be a hero, right, and get, oh, wow, what a great idea,
that is a
right?
great idea.
And so we'll find them through our other publications like Sports Illustrated, right?
Right.
And so we look for people, either men or women, who are in relationships with African American women or black
Right.
women.
Okay.
And so, okay, wasn't I being racist? Wasn't I being sexist? Wasn't I being discriminatory? I was.
But you intended to do so. So my
So that
question
makes
was
it okay?
unintentional bias, I guess.
See,
Unintentional and like manipulative
but see,
and illegal and
well,
bad.
it wasn't manipulative, but bad is the point.
Yes.
See, my point is, we should be talking about socially undesirable biases and discrimination. And if that's what we're talking about, then what's the difference? If we're talking about algorithms, or if we're talking about hiring practices,
Yeah.
or we're talking about advertising, or anything else we're talking about, we're talking not at the process, the mechanism, but what the outcome is.
Right.
And so the remedy for algorithmic biases is exactly the same, right? If I wanted to hire people, we don't say, well, the problem is with psychometrics and the test I was using to assess candidates. No, the problem was on the outcomes. I was looking for, and I created tests and mechanisms that discriminated against people wrongly,
Right.
and in socially undesirable ways and in illegal ways, right? And so my challenge with when we talk about algorithmic bias is we point at the geeks. And so we let the leadership of the organization abrogate their responsibilities and say, oh, it's a problem with the algorithm. No, it isn't. The problem is with the organization. The problem is with the leadership. The problem is with not telling the geeks, yeah, we want you to discriminate because, by the way, we certainly want you to discriminate between people who are likely to buy our product and those who aren't, but we don't want you to discriminate against people as a consequence of their gender, their ethnicity, their sexual orientation, these things that we care about.
So staying on, I guess let's go with the example of hiring.
Yes.
Right. And so you're saying the people blame the geeks, the data scientists, for the algorithm potentially excluding a certain population.
Yes.
How do we move away from that? So I think what the leaders and the business or the public says is, oh, this is a black box and we don't really understand it. The geeks built it. We told them what to do, but they built it. Nobody gets it. How do we get away from people using that as an excuse?
We treat it as an excuse. You know, it's funny. If I say, what is this I have in my hand? Most of us can see, well, it's a pair of eyeglasses. Do I have to, if I ask you and you say it's eyeglasses, do I say, now wait a minute, how much rhodopsin was being excreted by the rods and cones in your eyes? And what neuro uptake transmitter was traveling across the synapse between the neuron and the dendrite? Who cares?
And how did the light hit them and all of that, right? All that.
Right? Who cares? You say, it was glasses.
Yeah.
And so I don't know why we subject our algorithms to that standard that we don't for humans. Why we're saying, well, it's a black box, it's impenetrable. So is that gray squishy wetware we keep between our ears. And we've managed to manage along for, you know, I think people have been around for 100 years now. Almost 200 years? I don't know.
Something like that, yeah.
I didn't study that part of history. But, and so, you know, we do this perfectly fine. And if you are in charge of hiring for me, right? If you're my HR leader, and now we call it human capital analytics or people analytics,
Yeah.
and you hire just white men who graduated from these certain colleges who are over 6 foot tall, I'm not going to say, well, let me see that algorithm and see if I can better understand that. I'm going to say, are you nuts? You can't
Yeah.
do that, right? And so why are we changing that standard?
Yeah, that's a very good point. But that doesn't answer my question. So the question is, how do we actually increase transparency? And I know you're saying people don't have to necessarily understand the black box,
Yeah.
right? So that's your solution to it is just not treat it.
Well, my solution is to
problem.
focus on, at the risk of getting too geeky, it's y equals f of x, right?
Yeah.
So y is the outcome variable, f is the function of the factor of whatever that x
Yeah.
input is. We concern ourselves too much with the f and not enough with the y, right? And that is sort of a shift in thinking between regression thinking, as traditional statistical thinking, and machine learning.
Yeah.
Machine learning, we're giving examples to the machine, right? And we're
Training it,
helping
yeah.
it emulate that. The
Right.
process it uses to derive and come to that is a little bit more opaque. That said, if it really concerns someone, you can isolate the variables. Of course you can. I've done myself. If I want to, when we were, whether we were trying to find terrorists or people who bought tacos, I tell people I spent the first part of my career looking for serial killers and the last part looking for people who really like cereal, and it's kind of the same thing. But you can
I'm sure it is.
isolate
I'm
what
sure.
those variables are and take
Yeah.
a look at them and see if you were doing a regression analysis, what would you do? You would isolate the beta values, right? Or
Right.
those beta variables, beta weights. You can do the same thing if you sufficiently engineer, curate your data at the front with a machine learning algorithm. That's another whole conversation, but that's a big part of the problem now with AI and machine learning is too many people think you just throw a bunch of crap in and you let the black box do its magic. And
Yeah, and then spit out
not a good
perfect
idea.
solutions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
So Ken Politon says that all technology and business problems can be traced back to leadership. Do you agree with that statement?
Boy, that's a little bit broad, but I would say, let's say the vast majority. I would agree with that. I think that leaders, good leaders are defined, in my opinion, by people who take responsibility, who take ownership. That's what it means to be a leader. Being a leader doesn't just mean the trappings. It doesn't mean you get the big office and the perks and the compensation. It means you have responsibility and you take ownership. I believe in the buck stops here. I know that the organization I'm working with right now is headed by two truly remarkable people who I've become friends with. Mike McGuire is the CEO, and this fellow Shrikant Sastry runs advisory services. And that's sort of their mantra is it doesn't matter what happens in the organization, they own it. And they'll take responsibility for it. And I think that's the sign of a good leader. That's, I don't know if I'm a great leader, but it's one thing I've always held myself true to is no matter what happens in the organization that I am leading, ultimately I have to take ownership for it and responsibility for it. So I would have to conditionally agree with that. Look, you can always have some lunatic, whoever Jeffrey Dahmer was working for at that candy factory, it wasn't his fault. Jeffrey Dahmer was a lunatic and weird bad things can happen, but
Right.
by and large, yeah.
Yeah, there was a book I recently read, Extreme Ownership by
Yeah.
Jocko Willing and Leif Babin.
Yes.
It's all about that and full accountability, full ownership.
And I think that's true. The only caveat is, blithely, I'm kind of dismissing Dahmer, but look at Arthur Andersen is a great example. Arthur Andersen was this bulletproof accounting firm, right? They were one of the big five at the time. They were big five. You never met a more ethical firm, and I know a lot of the people who were from there. Just because you had these 6 rogue accountants in this office in Texas, it doesn't mean the leadership was horrible, and it doesn't mean that Arthur Andersen was horrible. Same thing. I think there are great people who've come out of, Theranos, out of WorldCom, out of some of these great horrible companies. Excuse me, horrible companies.
They were
that
great at
led,
some point, no?
Well, they were, but it doesn't. Yeah, the taint, and I think it goes both ways.
Yes. Okay, next question. You ready?
I'm always ready.
All right, Balaram Krishna Looks like in the future we will shift from data governance to algorithm governance. What do you think?
No.
Data
We will,
stoking?
yeah. Humans have a role and will always have a role. We can't completely give up on and say it's up to the machines, it's up to the algorithms. The machines, the algorithms will increasingly have a role to play and will continue to move to the fore. There's one of the founding principles in artificial intelligence research is something known as Moravec's paradox.
Moravec's?
Moravec.
Oh, Moravec.
It's named after Hans Moravec.
Okay.
And Moravec's paradox, in plain English, says humans are really good at things machines are bad at, and vice versa.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And so if I ask Alexa, I hope there's not an Alexa out in the room. If I say
All
to
the
Alexa,
Alexas go off,
yeah,
yeah.
exactly, Alexa, what's the square root of 3,256,253? Easy for
13?
Alexa.
No.
There you go, it's very good.
Is
But
it?
if I, no, you weren't even close.
I
But I tell you the answer, but then I'd be showing off.
Wait, what's
but,
the answer?
and
Tell
I'll
me.
tell you. But then if I ask Alexa, and Alexa knows instantly,
Of
right?
course.
If I ask
Show
you,
off.
obviously not so much. But
Hey,
if I ask
I just don't want to show off
Alexa,
either. Yeah.
who's better looking, my wife or my wife's best friend,
Oh.
Alexa actually says, I don't know. I would be killed if I
Yeah.
said that in my house,
That's a
right?
dangerous one, yes.
So, you know, people are good at perspective, compassion,
Yes.
humanity. There are these things
Creativity,
we're
that's-
creative. There are these things we're just better at, and I hate to say always, but for the foreseeable future will be.
Yeah.
And so the real solution is for us to increasingly work symbiotically with these systems so that they can give us more of what we don't do well, and we can give them what they don't do well.
But they're taking our jobs.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, they are. You know,
But do we want those jobs?
well, and that's the real question,
Yeah.
right? When our parents were young, when my parents were young, I'm way older than you. When my parents were young, the most populous job in New York, in Los Angeles, in Seattle, in Chicago, in LA was stevedore. Do you know what a stevedore is?
Something to do with outside manual labor.
Sure. Well, and that's the funny thing. This was like the most popular
I'm
job,
guessing.
and people don't even know what it is.
Stevedore.
They were the people who picked things up and put them down off of ships. They
Okay,
carried things
see,
on
I
and
was
off ships.
close.
You were very close.
Thank
But we replaced them with
Machines.
container ships and cranes and forklifts,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
But we don't have a bunch of stevedores wandering around, gee, what do I do? That's the
But
Joseph
it was
Schumpeter's notion
slow.
of creative destruction.
Yes.
Yes, and that's the difference. Jobs have always evolved and changed, and you know, I'm old enough to remember when we had this, it wasn't impolite, we had secretaries, it was a real job. Now we have EAs, and thank goodness, because we can't live without them. But we evolve, right? And a lot of the jobs we have today, what you and I do, didn't exist.
Yeah.
Certainly when I was a kid. And so we will have a loss. We will end up with a net gain. But one of the things I find interesting about that is the jobs that go away usually suck.
Yes.
Right? Think about
That's
technology
true,
has
that's true.
always replaced work, and it's always replaced the boring, the dangerous, the
mundane,
tedious,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so what's going to be left for us are the jobs that are by definition, go back to Moravec's paradox, more human. Now, does that mean we're not going to see some pain in the short term? It doesn't. We're going to, and I'm really concerned about that. Truck drivers, people, radiologists. I work now, I'm at Grant Thornton, and so I was doing a presentation for Grant Thornton talking about this. And I went to the website, willrobotstakemyjobs.com.
There's a website?
There's a website,
Check it out, guys.
willrobotstakemyjob.com.
Okay.
And I put in accountants, and I said, accountants and bookkeepers and auditors, and I said, what's the likelihood they'll be replaced? And it said, likelihood they'll be replaced, 98%. But it's worse.
Whoa.
Then I scrolled down, and it said on the website, you're doomed.
Oh my God.
Which is just unkind, right?
Wow.
These jobs are going away. But there's part of it also. See, you found the site. It's something that we know. We know it's coming. And so, you know, there's this ancient Chinese proverb I always loved. The
Yeah.
best time to plant a tree was 100 years ago.
I just made a video
The
about
second
this.
best time
It's
is
20
now.
years ago. Sorry to
Fine.
correct you, but
You're
you know,
wrong.
that's
I'm old. It was 100 years.
for me, it's 20. I don't know. That's what I told me.
But what would
I wasn't
Goodwin
here.
do to plant a tree 20 years ago?
Well, because you're
Yeah,
not alive
just
100
saying.
years ago. That's why it makes more sense. I win. Listen.
Fine. And so that becomes the point, is we know these things are coming.
Yeah.
And so the time to start preparing for that is now. So what do? You can learn the code, certainly. You can learn the technology. You can learn what we do.
Yeah.
Or you can learn the human side of it. And we've let go of a lot of that. You know, customer service, I hate to be that curmudgeonly old guy, but customer service isn't what it used to be.
Yeah.
And that will increasingly be valued, that human dimension of work, that this will be, right? It'll be a while before I'm interviewed by a machine as well as I'm interviewed by Queen Kate.
Thank you for that.
See, I'm sucking up to the host.
All right, so Ashutosh asked the question that I was actually going to ask. I'll give him the credit. So do you really think truck driving will take the job away?
Yes.
Basically, will truck drivers go away? My father-in-law is a truck driver.
Yeah.
And that's actually why this is like very close to me, because I do wonder what's going to happen.
And so let's talk about truck drivers as an example. It's a great example because there's currently about a shortage of about 60 to 65,000 truck drivers in the U.S.
A shortage.
A shortage. Okay. And so we don't have nearly enough of them. And so there's this economic imperative. The other part of that is, for most companies, nearly all companies, the number one cost is salaries, right? SG&A. In truck companies, that's typically 60 to 80% of your gross profits. Wow, is salaries.
Wow.
So the cost of replacing somebody with a machine becomes very attractive.
Yes.
We're going to see, and now we're talking about 1.5 million people who are in these roles. And so you're talking about a lot of rolling cost, right? For these people. And so this becomes easily replaceable from an economic standpoint. It makes a very compelling case. The other side of that, and this is my little soapbox, I started my career, you know, I have a weird background. I was a paramedic and a police officer, and then I became a deep sea rescue diver, and I was
It's not
with the
weird.
Special
Everyone
Forces.
does
I know
that.
everyone's
All my
done that.
friends were
But-
paramedic, police officer,
Exactly. I know,
rescue
it's
divers.
fairly common.
Yes.
But back when I was a paramedic and a cop, I responded to a lot of traffic accidents.
Yeah.
And we sort of think of these as statistics. And I'll tell you, until you have extracted, you know, flesh from metal that has come together at very high speeds, we lose 35 to 40,000 people a year, every year in the U.S. in automobile accidents. Worldwide, that's about 1.25 to 1.5 million people die in car crashes. Autonomous vehicles are, that virtually all goes away almost overnight. There will be some few instances, but a rounding error. And so the cost that we realize in human life and suffering, and I'm just talking about deaths.
Yeah.
You know, talk about all the people who are badly injured,
Who
are maimed, all the survivors, or the people who are left behind, the costs to the economy in, you know, traffic accidents and the damages, these things. Now, that said, what's ironic about this is truck drivers will be replaced. Uber drivers will be replaced. You and I, as drivers, not so much. Personal vehicles.
I wish I was. I don't like driving.
I know, but think about that. The average car ownership is about 11 and a half to 12 years.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So by the time we get to, and then you're talking about the additional price point, and so it'll be about 25, 30 years minimally before we start seeing a lot of, a large replacement. But what we will see very quickly are these, the trucks will be replaced, and then the Uber drivers and Lyft drivers will be replaced.
You know, it's interesting you were talking about risks and death of, you know, truck drivers and drivers in general, where somebody commented that they think it's going to be risky to have autonomous trucks on the road.
You know, I don't know if you heard about the accident down in Arizona.
No.
With a self-driving Uber, and it killed this woman.
Oh, yeah. That I did. I thought it was
I bring people's attention to this newspaper article, appeared on the front page, and it talked about how this woman was killed on a bicycle by a vehicle, and we need to, you know, stop all this technology.
Yeah.
Right. That was on the front page of the New York Herald back in the 1800s, when it was the first fatal car accident in New York. So, you know, look, I saw that video. I actually got to see the unedited, uncut video. No one could have avoided that accident.
Really?
These are machines. They're not magic.
Right.
That's
a good
they're going
point.
down the road,
I'm
and
gonna
the
write
woman,
that down, guys. These are machines. This is not magic.
it's not magic. You know, things are going to happen. But if I were driving that car, and I've been trained to drive emergency vehicles for many, many years, there's no way I could have avoided that woman. No one could have. It was impossible.
Could you argue that the machine had a higher chance of avoiding an accident than a human?
Absolutely. But that, you bring up a very important question is, would it have and should it have? That is what's called the trolley problem. We have to decide if the woman is coming out and the car can veer left but it would kill everyone in the vehicle.
Yeah.
What do we? But I would rather that we make those decisions societally and we algorithmize those than we leave it up to the exactly.
Like, oh no, I like her, I'll kill everybody else.
Yeah. And how do we know you're not going to do that? I mean, there are sick people out there, right?
That's
based
true.
on race or based on gender or, I don't mind running over, a little white woman or I don't know. There are nuts out there.
It's very specific.
I would rather that's built into the algorithms. That's just me, maybe.
All right, moving into a different direction. Could beat this one to death.
Hard not to.
So, China.
Ah.
Video surveillance cameras, right? Yeah. CCTVs, they're used for identification, finding where people are. They have a rating system.
Yes.
All that's happening.
Yeah,
do you see this trend coming to the U.S., and what are your thoughts on that just in general?
Well, you mean coming to the U.S. like FICO scores or
no, like the video surveillance. I mean,
but that's different, right? But
well,
look, we score people on credit ratings. We score people on a number of criterion.
Yes.
And as to facial recognition, do you remember after the Boston Marathon bombing?
They found the person.
And we were all hoping, right? And in fact, most of us were thinking, geez, why couldn't they identify that guy and those brothers and find them more quickly? And so I'm not advocating for it, but what I'm saying is, let's not delude ourselves either. It is here. I travel quite a bit, and when I go to Australia now, and the same thing is true in Singapore and a couple of other countries, as you come through passport checkpoint, the facial recognition you barely slow down.
I know, I did that recently.
Yeah,
you just stand there and it just finds you.
There you are, and it identifies you. And even in the US, when you're using the biometrics from your fingerprints, it's not really that much different. We are digitally encoding ourselves.
Yeah.
That said,
but we're doing something, like we're standing in front of a screen or we're swiping a finger.
Well, but it's passive also. I mean, when you're going to events now, and without saying stuff that will get me in a lot of trouble, well, actually, one of the things I can talk about, my team and I were just talking to DARPA, and we were talking about not only how do we improve upon those capabilities for facial recognition and image detection, but even when people are trying to hide.
Yeah.
And so how do you do it that much more effectively? That technology is progressing very rapidly. But that's a different question between your question when you're asking about the social index and those things. I find that really creepy. I think there is this big brother dimension.
Yeah.
But that's why I say, we treat these things as if they're technological problems, but they're not. They're sociologic, they're psychologic, they're political, they're governmental challenges. And I always, every time I write quite a bit on LinkedIn, and I get shouted down a lot when I start talking about economics and politics and government and these sorts of things, and I'll argue these things are inextricably linked. We can't just talk about the geek stuff. We have to talk about how these things interrelate.
Yeah, the geek stuff actually becomes easy after.
The geek stuff is always the easy part. It's always the, making some of these decisions, these political decisions, these economic decisions. That's where it's tough.
So Gregory Waldron says, freedom though.
Freedom!
What about freedom? What happens to my freedom?
I don't know. I think that's one of those very amorphous terms. I don't know what we really mean by that.
Yeah,
well, really,
true.
I mean, there's. I put out a post recently. The administration has decided that it was not going to endorse a sanction against Nazism by the United Nations. Did you hear this?
No.
Yeah, this is like a week or 2 weeks ago. Our UN representative says we will not sign on to international sanctions saying that we are against Nazism. And the reasoning that the delegate gave was, well, that curtails freedom of speech. Well, that's ridiculous. Nazism is by its definition an advocacy of violence,
Yeah,
right? It's
right.
hate speech by definition. I mean, I don't care what your beliefs are.
Right.
That's if you're a Nazi, you're saying, right, we should kill all these other people.
Right.
We're promoting violence. And the point I made in this argument was there's a distinction between democracy and anarchy. Right? And we have to draw a line and be able
Yeah.
to say
It
that
is-
freedom of speech does not mean freedom to incite violence and to harm others. And
Right.
so when we talk about things like freedom, I spent a very large part of my career in uniform and fighting on behalf of freedoms. The motto of the Special Forces, most people don't know, is De Oppresso Liber, which is liberation of the oppressed. That's really what we're all about. That's what I did as a cop. That's why I was a paramedic. That's why I worked in government. I truly believe in the system. I truly believe in freedoms, and not just Americans' conceptualization, idealization of freedoms, but I've been around the world and have talked about these things. I'm a devout believer, but freedom isn't free and it isn't unconstrained. And so we have to also talk about how do we parameterize this to maximize freedom for more people, and how do we do that without also veering into this notion of utilitarianism, where it's just
Yeah.
for the greater good, and we let other people suffer.
It's interesting how you called it freedoms, not freedom, because I guess it's hard to define just general freedom.
I think that's
There's-
true.
Yeah.
Don't you?
I agree, yeah.
Yeah.
So, kind of on the same topic, but going into politics a little bit.
Uh-oh.
Russell Willis asks, do you think that advanced predictive analytics will be embraced in the world of political campaigning?
Oh, they already are.
I was going to say
yeah, that
they
was the
are
work.
present, but are they being embraced?
Absolutely. That was the work that I think really changed things that we did for the Obama campaign for 2012. And very much to his credit, President Obama wasn't looking to skew his message, and he wasn't looking to be driven by the polls. What he was telling us, his sort of remit for us was, I want to truly attune myself to what the various constituencies, what the various publics are thinking and what they're saying. What do they care about? And what words connect and resonate with them? What should I be addressing? What matters to them? And we've been doing that for a very long time. One of my favorite quotes in this regard comes from Marcus Tullius Cicero, over 2,000 years ago, one of the greatest orators in history. And he famously said, if you wish to persuade me, you must think my thoughts, feel my feelings, and speak my words.
I'm like, that name sounded familiar. I just read your article on LinkedIn. You quoted
I
him.
quote him a
You
lot.
quoted
I
him.
like that quote. I like Cicero.
Yeah.
But I like that idea of,
Think my thoughts.
yeah, shouldn't we try, and I think, by the way, that's the same thing is true in marketing, right? Unfortunately, I get quoted correctly a lot, and I got quoted correctly in the Wall Street Journal once for making the point that politics is a product like any other.
Right.
And the point I was making was, if we're marketing, any marketing campaign or political campaign is the same thing,
Yeah.
shouldn't it really ultimately not be about tricking people into buying crap they don't need? It should be about understanding our customers, giving them the respect to, I don't know, think their thoughts.
Right.
Or understand their thoughts, understand their feelings, and speak in words that will viscerally resonate with them. That's what marketing and advertising is really about.
Yeah.
And I think that's true of politics, of products, but even of ideas. One of the challenges we have right now with everything from climate change to inoculations is we're not communicating effectively, and we need to get better at it, and this will get us closer to that.
So, yeah. I
Yeah.
agree. Yeah. Moving on from that topic. Hold on. We're going to go into healthcare now.
Okay.
So, Balaram's question is, what are your thoughts on the ethical and legal challenges for IoT? So, for example, healthcare apps, like Fitbit or others, I guess.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I was at Samsung when we came out with our watch that was able to, among other things, it performed like a Fitbit. And it was able to take your pulse. And one of my questions was to us as Samsung, when do we cross a line? Do we have a duty to respond? What if I can detect your heartbeat, I can tell if you're in...
You need an ambulance or something?
Yeah, and I can tell if you might be in trouble. Do I have a duty Or do I have a duty to tell you, or to call an ambulance, or
yeah.
to tell you, and if
That's a
I
good question.
have a Bluetooth scale, I have a Bluetooth scale and I'm waiting for it now to tell me, dude, you're fat. And you need to not be fat anymore. I don't know, you start crossing those lines, but
Yeah.
my wife is a nurse, and
Okay.
she has been in ICU, she works in the ICU. She's been I'm not supposed to say it on camera, but she's been a nurse for 40 years. And still does bedside care, still
Wow.
amazing. I've been begging her
That's
to
a really
retire
tough
for
job.
20
That's-
years. Very dedicated, very committed, but she takes privacy very, very, very seriously. We never, ever, ever talk about her patients.
Okay.
We never talk about any of that stuff. She takes HIPAA and all those constraints and conditions. But even before all that, patient confidentiality.
Yeah.
And so now with technology, with IoT, with this confluence of data where I can know a couple of little bits about you and start to make inferences, I think that starts to take us down a slippery slope. What my real concern is going to be, when are we going to start making decisions predicated on that for insurance,
Yeah.
for extending medical care, for, should you not get an organ because I know that you also are a skydiver? I don't know. When do we start getting on that slippery slope of how much data do we collect toward what end? And again, I think the laws are going to have to catch up a little bit.
Yeah, there's also the side of, like, for example, identifying cancer, right? But you need to get people's consent to provide,
Well,
to
there's
see that data.
a
so
great
they
example.
can-
I just did that 23andMe, and it has
Oh,
health
you did?
check.
Okay.
I did. And,
And what
I'm
are
a
you?
geek. Bizarre. 99% Neanderthal, I think. No, but I do have
I was
some
going to have people
Neanderthal.
guess.
I know.
Where do you think JT?
Where do
Dr.
you think I hail
Kostman.
from?
Yes,
That's right. And so my wife and I both did. And they tell you some interesting things. Like they'll tell you if you have the BRCA gene, which I don't think.
What is that?
It's a cancer
Oh, okay.
marker. And so
Oh, they
neither
tell
did
you
my
that.
wife. They tell you that. And right, but
Ugh.
that is like,
Yeah.
And so now this
You have
data
to-
is out there.
Did you have to say, like, I'm okay with finding out this
You
information?
did. As a
Okay.
matter of fact, it
I would
goes through
think
like
so. That's-
several tiers, and it says, "Do you want to know? Do you really want? Do you really, really,
Oh my
really want to
God.
know?" And so now, by the time you get to like, you're like,
I don't know.
"I don't know.
anymore.
Yeah, why are you asking me?" And so it was like, go ahead and tell me. It's like, good. But
Yeah.
my challenge is there are also, because we're geeks, there are covariants with these things, right? So now, what if you get a catalog, and I don't know why, but for some reason, one of the cigar companies put me on their, I don't smoke, and so one of the cigar companies put me on their catalog, and I like get this catalog all the time,
Okay.
and I don't smoke, but if someone had access to that data and saw that I was getting this catalog and they send me one like every week practically, I know.
Okay.
And so if you were putting that data into the mix of your black box machine learning algorithm, might you say there's a high correspondence between people who smoke and people who get this catalog? Of course.
Right.
Right.
Of course, because why
And
else would you
so,
get it?
Maybe now I'm a higher risk.
Mm.
That kind of thing concerns me.
Yeah, that's true. And somebody here was asking about.
So if you're watching, stop sending me that catalog.
That's funny. They probably are watching.
I know.
You know.
I know.
Um,
I also get one from Uniline, and they send it's like the size
Wait,
of
isn't that
the
makeup
old,
or something?
No.
no,
It's
that's
for
also- I don't
industrial
wear it.
equipment.
Yeah.
And we ordered a coat rack from them literally 20 years ago, and this thing is like the size of the Manhattan Yellow Pages, and they send it to us like every month. Stop sending it! You're killing a tree every month for nothing.
Yeah, I know. That's terrible. I get a lot of weird magazines.
Really?
Not okay. Wow, this took a turn.
That's a whole different.
So,
It
Russell Willis says, could it happen that insurance companies integrate health wearables? Or, sorry, he said interrogate. I read it wrong. To search for ignored notifications, for them to leverage as a reason to avoid paying claims?
Boy, that's a great question. And could the opposite also be true? Could I say, they have a couple of the car insurance companies now have that little plug-in you can put into your
Oh, yeah,
vehicle.
to see how you're driving.
Right, see how
and
you're
stuff,
driving.
yeah.
Could you imagine one of the healthcare providers saying, if you wear this Fitbit and you agree to have a Bluetooth scale and you'll do, whatever, a breathalyzer, then we'll give you a decrease. I can absolutely, I'll bet that's coming soon
I'll be
a theater
surprised
near
if it's
you.
not here yet.
Right? And so I think that question is exactly the antipode of that, right? It's so if they have this to benefit you, and tacitly it's to consequent you also, right? So if you don't do those things and you're not adherent, and can you imagine them saying, there you go. And so, maybe we won't insure you, or we won't give you the special rate unless you wear these things.
I think that's definitely coming, and it's slightly relevant, but going back to replacing people and drivers, and actually this is about traffic police officers. I was in an Uber. Let's start with that. And this guy had like his phone as a GPS, and every time he went above the speed limit, his phone went like beep 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 beep, and it would turn red, and he slowed down. So instead of having police spend their time looking at how fast people are driving, he can just get a ticket every time he goes above the limit.
Yeah, and well, we already
or stays above the limit for a certain duration
now,
of time.
right? That's what speed cameras do. I mean, have it help you. Little safety tip: if anyone is driving around the DC metro area, slow down, because the cameras there are brutal. Oh, they are now, and they are calibrated to, if you're like 3 miles an hour over the limit, they'll get you. And increasingly, as that technology continues to evolve, we see the same thing with try beating an easy pass, right? I mean, they got you nailed. Or try traffic lights, and so increasingly, what we're talking about then is just moving the means of transmission. So could your Easy Pass, which is a transmitter, right, if rather than it just signaling that Easy Pass that you're coming through, can you imagine a point where we put up receivers along the highway to be able to estimate your speed? I mean, it's simple calculus, right? It's not that, it's not rocket surgery.
Right.
Actually, it kind of is rocket science, but it's easy rocket science.
So Mark Weissman says you can now get a discount on insurance if you submit your steps or something. So
really? Okay, see? So they've beaten us to it.
All right, we spoke a little bit about the apps and the opt-ins and not reading your ULA and stuff, but what's your view on apps that track your location that don't need your location at all?
Let's be controversial again.
Of course.
Nobody really cares. You don't care.
About my location?
Yep. And you know how I know you don't care?
I turned it off today.
Do you have one of these? See, I brought a present with me.
I know, you brought it last time when you presented.
This is anyone who's watching, write in, I'll give you a second, write in if you know what this is. Go ahead, let's see.
We have a 40-second delay, so.
Dun, 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 dun. Okay, then we're going to guess nobody.
No. Let them put this down for now.
Okay.
Talk about other stuff.
So, right now, I would defy anyone who's writing in to tell me they don't own a smartphone. Everybody does, right?
I think
Smartphones have only been around for, do you know how long? 12 years. 2007.
Yeah, I had a flip phone. I had a typewriter, man.
There we go. I
really did.
I had a can and a string.
We came from Tajikistan. Okay.
I had yelling out the window, Mark, it's time for dinner. Exactly. But now we all have a smartphone, and if you have a smartphone, your carrier knows where you are, and they know who you're with, and they know what you've been doing. If you have Gmail, right? If you have any of these apps that you opt into, Angry Birds takes your location.
Why?
Those of you who said or didn't say,
no, we have a few guesses. Wait.
Go ahead. What do we got?
Russell Willis was the first one. RGID blocking wallet, and then John says RFID, and then Russell corrected himself and said RFID.
RFID, it's a Faraday bag is what it's called. And a Faraday bag, it's kind of the same thing. Instead of blocking just RFID signals, it blocks all signals. And it costs...
Wait. But your phone is not in there.
No, because I don't use the damn thing. Nobody uses them.
Why do you bring it with you?
To tease you.
The second time
but that's my
bring
point.
it.
I bought this on Amazon for $10.
But you never have your phone in.
And no one else does either. I've never found anyone who, I put my phone, and is it in one? No. No one bothers to put their phone in this. But if you did, no one would know where you are, and the companies wouldn't have your data.
Yeah.
But we don't care enough about that, right? Because we prefer the convenience. We prefer what it gives us to not have to contend with that. And so while we say we don't want an intrusion on our privacy, and we don't want people to know where we are,
but we don't care.
that's hogwash, nonsense. And I think increasingly there are these. One of the unfortunate things when you do like attributional research, surveys and polls and interviews, is people say things that are socially desirable that they don't really mean. If I ask everybody, do you care about the environment? Well, of course you do. But
Of
what have
course
you
I
actually
do.
done today about it? Exactly.
Today?
Did you say the whales or the spotted owls, or did you, right? And so we ask people things.
I gave you coffee.
You did give me coffee. I don't know if you thought that somehow cut down on global warming, but that's a whole different thing. Thank you for the coffee. And didn't even give it to me in a ceramic mug,
All right,
in a
put it-
paper mug. See, so
Wait, but it has a tree.
it does have a tree, so that makes
So it
everything
makes
okay.
it- yeah.
Yeah.
So,
That balances the
any-
world out.
Thank you for that. Mike Delgado says he likes his stats. He likes getting his stats, so he doesn't mind being tracked everywhere he goes.
Yeah.
That's good.
And by the way, it's also a safety thing, isn't it? I mean, I like the idea
Somebody
that
knows how to find
my
you?
wife and my daughter and
Yeah.
my granddaughters and my grandson, that if heaven forbid something happens, that they have that tether a little bit, and
Yeah.
we can locate them.
No,
I like
that's
the
true.
idea even that you can. I see smartphones now. When they first started to come into prominence and they were talking about giving them to kids,
Yeah.
I insist that my grandchildren should have smartphones. I think it's a safety issue now, right?
What about those tracking devices? The little one you can put on your kid's shoe or
If
something?
I could put it in their skin, I would. But I gotta tell you, man, it's gotten to be a very weird, scary world.
Does it make you feel like you're becoming more paranoid? Kind of like,
No,
because
I've
if
always
they
been
leave the
really
range, you get a
paranoid.
notification. I mean, yes, okay, so.
Yeah.
I mean, us as a population.
I think part of it is regrettably justifiable.
Yeah.
I think they've always, in addition to being a data scientist and mathematician, I'm also a shrink. And I'll tell you, the world has always had, these little sick bits. And we already have always had these people who are a little bit, off center.
Yeah.
But there are statistics on both sides, and I've heard studies on both sides. On one hand, saying we're getting. Steven Pinker argues that things are getting better and we're all evolving, and others are saying, not so much. You hear about things every day, and maybe it's just a consequence of media focus, but that are unimaginable. I actually remember when the Manson family was a thing, when it was in the news, and it was mind-blowing. No one could even believe this. And today, Charles Manson didn't actually kill anybody. He's almost, in the list of serial killing psychopathic lunatics, and my wife, she loves the murder shows. I don't know why, it should scare the hell out of me. But we were watching, we watched the other night, and it's this serial killer who killed a bunch of people, and we never even heard of him. And this is almost becoming mundane now. And some of these crimes, some of these things people engage in, I think we have to be more vigilant nowadays.
No, when my first daughter started pre-K, the first thing I did was Google, like, how do I track her? Because she's never been out of the house.
I'm telling
she's
you.
3, and I mean, I guess I'm paranoid as well.
Well, Megan's Law, you don't know where all the lunatics are in your neighborhood. We all do now. And I think we should.
That's true.
And part of that is the fragmentation of society. We used to live in these small communities. We knew everybody.
Yeah.
Didn't mean everyone was okay, but when you were
but
a
at least
little
you
girl,
knew,
right?
yeah.
You knew everyone in your community.
Yeah.
And
Well,
but
I didn't get out much. We
different
didn't leave
than
our house
here,
much. Yeah.
Right? I know.
Different country,
Different country,
situation.
different time. There you
Yes.
go. Yeah, for me, it was only the other 5 people who lived in caves nearby. It's a long time ago.
Caves. I thought tents or something.
No,
Still
not even
caves.
tents.
Okay.
Yeah, still caves. Yeah.
All right, fake news. So, social media, speed of which things travel, technology, innovation. So, how big of a problem is fake news?
It depends on how you define fake news. If you define fake news as being anything that doesn't agree with your perspective or your insane view of the world, then it's not a problem at all. And there are people in actually elected office now that tend to, anything that...
No way.
Yeah, I've heard of this.
Yeah.
Anything they don't agree with is fake news. And that's nonsense. I'm a great advocate of the press. My son's a journalist.
Okay.
And I worked for Time Inc. and
Yeah.
I have tremendous admiration and respect for journalists. And I actually even love the idea of the democratization of journalism. Things like this, I think this really, not just pandering to you, no, I think this provides a real service, right? To be able to get people access to information they might not have otherwise.
Yeah.
But I think it becomes now more incumbent on us to be more discriminating, smarter consumers of that information.
So
And that's where it shifts.
Let me define what I was trying to say with my version of fake news.
Yeah.
So the technology that we have today can put your face on me and I can say things on TV.
That would be disturbing on so many levels.
You know what I mean? I can literally do that now with like
That's
Snapchat or
true.
something. We can face swap
That's
and
true.
I can
That's
and
true.
I can announce that, you know, I'm
Well,
going to
and
do X,
even
Y,
a
Z.
lower tech
So-
version, I mean, we can just blast out and say JT said, and just
Yes,
throw-
but I'm going to
and
the
now-
high-tech version, like,
Yeah.
and where it's moving.
I think it's a big problem. It really is. But again, that comes down to being a more discriminating consumer,
Yeah.
right? What are the odds that would come out from the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN? It wouldn't. And if you're on one of these lunatic fringe websites
Yeah,
and you're
that's
seeing
true.
this, don't you have to say to yourself, you know, what did our parents always tell us? Consider the source,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And increasingly, we have to do that. We can't treat all sources of information as
Yeah.
though they're equal. And that becomes sort of the crucible problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we're even hearing people who are denying, you know, climate change and that vaccinations are effective and these sort of things, you don't hear this coming from the American Medical Association and the American Climatological Association, the Association for the Advancement of Science is coming out and saying, oh well, you know, no, you know.
Well, in some cases, you've heard people. I won't talk about it. Anyways, keep
Okay.
going. Yeah.
But, well, and that's my point. I'm not saying it's not
Yeah.
worth considering. If you know, someone who is a very credible person
Yeah.
is saying, look, this whole gravity thing, I'm not, well, look, and if you're Stephen Hawking, passed away recently, if Stephen Hawking came out and said, you know, everyone's been talking about gravity ever since Newton, I got to tell you, I have a little bit of a different take. I would listen to that.
Yeah,
I would
kind of
hear
like
that.
when the Earth was flat and then it wasn't anymore.
You know, and that's what we don't call it a law of gravity. It's a theory, right?
Yeah, right.
And until that's the idea of science.
I can
Until
prove it, though.
a better theory comes along.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's the difference between math and science. Math is absolute.
Yeah.
But I think we have to be receptive to alternative perspectives, but
Yeah.
not alternative facts and not alternative truths, right? And we have to consider who those sources come through.
Yeah.
You know, Bernard Baruch once said, every man has a right to be wrong in his opinions. No one has a right to be wrong in their facts. And I think
Yeah.
that's the truth of it. You and I can disagree that, you know, this is delicious coffee. This, by the way, is delicious coffee. Thank you very much. But we can disagree on that. But we can't disagree that this is a cup. It's
Right.
a cup. And there's, there was coffee in it at one time.
Yes.
Those are facts. And,
Yes.
and so we need to start, you know, one of the things we've gotten away from even our educational system is an emphasis, who takes courses anymore on logic and on how to think? And we
I
need
took
to
a
get
course
back
on
to that.
logic.
And
It was a requirement.
In the
Baruch,
US?
well, yeah,
Really?
in
Good.
college though.
That's awesome.
It wasn't. It should have happened like in fifth
Should have
grade or
happened
something.
in elementary school,
Yes.
but yeah, more of us, and by the way, that goes back to your earliest questions about ethics and morality.
Yeah.
Right? You can do a degree in computer science. Do you get a course on ethics? No.
No, but
in
I think
the
you
MBA
should.
program, you get maybe a couple of conversations about it.
Mhm.
I think everyone should, don't
Yeah,
you?
absolutely.
In ethics, in logic, and how to think, and how to ingest information and consider information more effectively.
Yes, that actually. So Russell Wills brought up another good point. Very active member of this conversation.
Go.
Thank you, Russell. So he says fake news is a horrible misuse of media, but many users are complicit in its propagation with impulsive liking, posting, sharing without first verifying the source.
I think that's absolutely
part of the
true.
problem.
We are the problem.
We're like, oh, this is cool. Share
Right,
it,
it's
like,
that
post, boom.
amplification. You know, it's.
Yeah.
I'm a great fan of Kara Swisher's. She's a big whistleblower and she a bit of a muckraker, and I really like her. She got caught up recently in there was an issue that was that one where those kids that with the MAGA hats confronted that Native American fellow in the halls on the steps of Congress. Anyway, she jumped right to and said bad kids,
Right.
and people called her out on it. Very much to her credit, she immediately said, you know what, you're right. I propagated a wrong message, and she owned it and took
Right.
ownership of it. That's what responsible journalism does.
Yeah.
Responsible journalists don't not make mistakes. Mistakes are going to be made. Things are going to be said. But I think that point is exactly on spot. We can't just blindly, yay, we support this because we happen to agree with it or like it,
Yeah.
and not be willing to walk back. I've been very critical about a number of things this administration has done, but I've also, and it frankly caused me pain to have to come up and also say, you know what, this was great. This was a wonderful thing that was done, I think, on behalf of us all, that we should celebrate. And I've also, on one instance, I spoke prematurely, and I had to come back and say, on reflection and on further consideration, I'm going to change my mind about this. And that's one of the things that we have become increasingly unwilling to do.
Change our minds?
Change our minds.
Yeah, we grab onto the thing and refuse to let go.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's hard. People don't want to do things that are hard.
It is hard, but the economist John Maynard Keynes was once doing a press conference, and he was stating an opinion on something, and one of the reporters called him on it, and he said, you were saying exactly the opposite just a couple of weeks or months ago. And he said, young man, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do?
Yeah.
And I thought,
that's powerful.
that's cool, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what you have to be willing to. You have to be willing to be wrong. You have to be willing to change your mind, and you have to be willing to admit it and acknowledge it. And that's how we contend with things like fake news and some of those things.
Great. Well, Dr. Kostman, I think we have come to
Queen Kate.
we have come to a stopping point. We've gone over an hour, and I want to thank you for your time. We have probably hundreds of questions more that came in. Really, it was like a lot of engagement on this.
I hope you'll all connect with me on LinkedIn. Let's continue the conversation.
Everybody message him privately. He has
Message
all the
me
time in the
privately.
world.
Join
He's going
me,
to answer
follow
all.
me. Yeah, that's what I'm
He's
going
going
to
to answer every single question.
I'll write an article.
No, definitely follow Dr. JT Kostman. As you can see, he's awesome. And thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Kate.
All right, and thanks you for tuning in.
Bye, guys. And keep waving awkwardly.